jump in and ask any questions of Tammy about these preliminary subdivision approvals for Sundown. I will mention that during the chair and vice chair meeting on Thursday, we had an extensive discussion where we pulled, Tammy and Rick had pulled in one of the engineers to talk to us in detail, because we had a number of questions about detention ponds and road access and a number of different things. They pulled in, and we had a lengthy discussion with the engineering department. And they have impressed upon how involved they've been every step of the way and getting into the nitty gritty of everything. But if there is anything specific prior to the meeting, you want to kind of get a little bit more information on, we get a good time.
Just from my discussion with Commissioner Barber, what's the topography like? What's the elevation changes? And is this one of those where they're gonna say, oh, well, gosh, it's awful steep, can we get a variance on?
No, this one, so the topography is steep. There are a lot of engineering issues that they're having to work through with our county engineers, with Weaver Fire District. They don't have any roads that exceed maximum grades for fire. They don't have any roads, I think, that go over 6 to 7%. There are some pretty heavy duty retaining walls that are part of both of these developments. UDOT is having to look at those. Weber County Engineering is looking at those. They both have to sign off on those before we will allow these guys to get their final approval. Those are kind of the main things, along with managing their stormwater on site, tying into, you know, any existing infrastructure up there. But I think most of it's going to be managed on site. They are showing some detention ponds at the bottom, right along Summit Pass or Powder Mountain Road, actually. So those have been, and I will tell you that the condos phase 2, that particular development, we've had that in for the last 2 years. We've gone back and forth. There have been, frankly, countless discussions between the county engineers and the developer regarding that, between Weaver Fire District and the developer regarding those slopes and turns and the layout of the roadways. And engineering and fire don't seem to have any major concerns at this point. They will look more closely at the engineering when they go for final. However, engineered plans have already been submitted.
Say it again. What plans have been submitted?
Engineered plans have been submitted to county engineering.
They just haven't given their approval or not.
They haven't given their final approval on it, but from what they can see, it looks feasible. They're okay with what's being proposed so far.
And this is the first, just for everybody, the condominiums is the first item on the agenda.
Yes. Mhm.
Condominiums are, it's an extension of what's already up. It's more.
Yeah.
So let me ask you just a general question, because just based on what I've seen, this is the most challenging, probably, development, just retaining walls, moving all that dirt, roads, all that stuff. Is today's agenda item time sensitive? So I guess my question is, what if what's on the agenda tonight was delayed until after engineering and fire and UDOT made their final decision? Because I did see public safety issues, and I see some of those retaining walls. Cause I was up there yesterday, and I stopped and got out of the car and paid real close attention to the extent I could tell what would have to happen for what I saw on paper to actually be built. And it looks like some of those retaining walls are gonna have to be on, like, almost straight down on the backside where it comes up Summit Pass Road. Which if someone, you know, if they can be engineered, and somebody were to fall, or a vehicle, or, you know, would go down there, they would not be a good outcome. So if they are. We don't know if engineering is going to say okay, or if fire is going to say okay. So it almost seems that that would be good to know before this agenda item would be deliberated in detail.
So I will tell you that they have a preliminary approval for these townhomes based on the previous road layout. Preliminary approvals are good for 18 months. They got that in January of last year. So they have until the end of June to get their final approval on the previous road layout. What they're coming before you with now, there is no change to the location of the lots, the building pads, not to the density. The only thing that they are seeking a preliminary approval on is a change to that connection. So they're going from a proposed 3 connections onto that UDOT highway to 2 connections, which is the one at the bottom that currently accesses phase 1 already, and the one at the top on the Summit Pass Road that was proposed previously.
You just said
But-
townhomes though.
But those,
I
Sorry,
just wanna make sure we're still talking about the same.
condos,
Okay.
sorry, condos and townhomes, but these are condominiums, yes.
so in this last year that's transpired, they haven't been able to get their engineering done and approved.
Well, what has happened over the last year, since you last saw this, they have purchased the land to the west.
Right.
So when they came before you previously, last January, they were required to secure an easement through that land before they could come back for final approval. They have since purchased that land. That's where the second development is,
Yep.
that's on the agenda tonight. But because they purchased that, they've kind of redrawn their plans now. And they've come back before you tonight. Now, we have required some kind of input from UDOT, which is why it's taken so long for this to get before you for a preliminary approval. UDOT has given them some favorable comments, but they don't have a formal approval, which is what we are requiring before they get their final approval.
So the additional land they bought for the additional 22 units is definitely the easiest plan to deal with. There, it's it has less slope.
Yeah.
Easier to get the roads in and out, sure.
Mhm.
I guess my wondering is related to the first phase, or phase, I guess it would be called phase 2 or 3.
So
Where
you,
where the condos, 60 condos are gonna go.
the 60 units are
Yeah.
phase 2.
Yeah, phase 2. So that's where I just see, and when I was looking at it a little more specifically, having seen this layout, where I see the real steep retaining walls having to
Mhm.
be put in. For that section, not necessarily the third phase.
They've got them in the 3rd phase, actually. They run along the western boundary along UDOT. But they are proposing some pretty heavy duty retaining walls for our county engineering. Yeah,
So the third phase will definitely need them, and I would imagine they'd be contiguous with the second phase retaining wall, at least on the. What I look at as the backside, but nowhere near as steep. Just because the land doesn't roll down
Mhm.
steep, and it's already, you can see, it's either been cut or it's already fallen away. You can see where it actually goes straight down in one spot already. And they're just gonna have to continue that back almost all the way to the road to get in there. What's it on this drawing? I mean, just to me, it looks unsafe from all sorts of different ways. So I'm just concerned that at some point, you know, some of the more technical authorities are gonna say, well, they're gonna have to make a decision at some point.
But, so what I heard you say was that you were questioning whether we should hold off on preliminary approval until the final approval from, I think it was engineering. And I thought I heard you say, and I might have missed the words, but I thought I heard you say that they that they were planning to give their final approval prior to our final approval, not preliminary approval. Where are we with this? If his question is, should we wait until engineering it's final approval.
Yeah, I guess
Is
my
that appropriate now? It's a preliminary approval, or is that
my question is, they've had it at least a year, longer than a year, but at least a year since it's last come here. And I know the road is a little different. To get the engineering and all that other stuff done, and they haven't, because it's not easy. And I guess my concern would be that, or my question is, why does this have to happen now versus after those more significant approvals, which will be yes or no, break or no break, for them to ultimately do this?
So in order to meet application requirements, they don't have to submit a set of final engineered plans for their preliminary approval. Engineered plans are incredibly costly, and to ask that of the developer when they have no vesting in it, it's a lot. Which is why we don't typically ask for it. However, with recent changes to state code and who the land use authority is and how our process is now working, we have required developers to submit a separate application for final approval. Okay, and one of the application requirements for final approval is that county engineering signs off on their engineered plans. So at this point, they've submitted enough to engineering that engineering doesn't have any major concerns with what they're proposing. They're okay with this getting preliminary approval. They will hash out more details with the engineered plans before they can even submit an application for final approval. So by the time it goes to Rick, who's the land use authority for final approval, they have approval from county engineering for their engineered plans. They have addressed any concerns with slope, retaining walls, roadways, access. They've addressed all of fire's concerns as well, and they will have their final approval from UDOT. Yeah, so I don't know if that helps alleviate some of your concern, Commissioner Barber.
Well, yes and no, I know there's a sequencing, but I'm just wondering this, approval by this committee, which is, I guess, not charged to look at all those technical details, but to look at it from a little different angle. I would like to know that all those other entities believe it's absolutely safe.
But can't we say hypothetically, yes, we'll approve it, subject to
it's
ABC.
already
in
said
here, right?
that.
Yeah, that's why these
It's-
findings that she wrote in there, I have them underlined because they made me feel better. That, so if we are to go with the findings of tonight, it does stipulate before it can even come before Rick later, they have to have every single final approval by all the different agencies, and that makes me feel better and say, okay, if they come with a preliminarily, these departments don't see any issues at the moment. But
And-
once we get into the real nitty gritty,
And at that point, with the planning commission's preliminary approval, then they'd spend a pile of money to get their final stuff done. Is that what I'm gathering
Correct.
between the lines here?
Right, now they have their vesting in their density,
Right.
in their road layout, and now they can proceed to spend a whole lot of money on getting those engineered. If they can't address all of those concerns, then they don't move forward for final approval. Their preliminary approval expires 18 months from the date that they get that from you. And they
So
try
18
again
months from
and
now,
from tonight.
not
No,
from
before.
January of 24.
January of 24, they had a slightly different road layout.
this is gonna supersede that.
We're just
Yeah.
kicking the
Yeah.
can down
A
the road
little,
again.
well, a little bit of adjustment, but I was concerned, one of the things I brought up in our meeting on Thursday was, if we grant approval, do they use that to influence the next, the way it works in business?
I would hope they couldn't do that.
Well, and that
Unless
was
they're
the
experts in
response.
What your concerns are.
That was the response that planning came
Yeah.
back to me with and said, they don't play that game in the business world, yes, in this, no, they're not gonna say, oh, the planning department said yes, so fire is gonna sign off, right? It's not gonna work like that.
So, sounds like the concern is a circular reference kind of a thing that we want to avoid.
Does the chicken come before the egg or?
But if we approve this, then engineering either says, no, can't make it work, it's not gonna fly. And then it never gets to the final decision maker, Rick, the final approval. If they come back and they say, oh yeah, it meets everything. Okay. It seems our typical practice is we defer to the engineering department for engineering approvals. We don't try and second guess things.
Mhm.
And same on the health department, all these other entities. So I don't understand how anything would be improved by saying, well, we won't look at the engineering until you've given your final approval on the engineered designs that aren't really required yet. Because we want to second guess the engineering department. Because we're concerned about safety.
See, the expectation, I think, is that because we're not experts in all areas, we kind of have to rely on the engineering and the health department and the fire department to say, yeah, this makes sense. And as long as they dot their i's and cross their t's, we're just asked to say, is this okay? I think, do I have it right?
Yes, and there are cases when the planning commission maybe sees something, especially where you're from that general area. And you kind of have more boots on the ground, maybe, you know, we've had some instances where we've had planning commissioners say, hey, wait a minute, just so you know, this is going to affect this on the adjacent parcel or something like that, that maybe we're not, I mean, we're heavily reliant on the planning commission's input. But there are certain things that legally they are entitled to.
So if there's a concern about safety, nobody wants a car going off the cliff retaining wall.
Right.
One of the conditions with findings could be that this could present a huge safety factor. We encourage engineering to address any safety concerns of cars falling off retaining walls.
I guess
We've done stuff like that before.
yeah, and I guess to restate maybe I didn't state clearly enough. My thoughts is that until they actually spend the money to do the engineering and submit the final, what they think is final, and engineering looks at it, I think there's as good a chance, one way or the other, that road may have to change.
Right.
I just looking from putting my eyeballs right on it now in the winter when there's snow and there's all the difficult things going on up there, to me, it looks like we're gonna have to move so much dirt and put in such significant retaining walls that road may not work. There's not a lot of room between the back of their existing phase and the road, so, and it goes up like this. So I would like, just myself, the peace of mind and understanding this, I'd like to know the final engineering, what's the final road gonna look like? Yeah, they can come back and ask for more changes, but yes, and I guess I've tried never to look at things from an economic standpoint, sitting here. Is it gonna cost the developer an extra whatever, or are they gonna make less money, or is it? They can maybe earn their money back quicker, one way or the other. I've tried not to consider those issues. In thinking through some of these things, and just to me, over the last 2 years, of all the things that have come forward on agendas, this seems to be the most challenging from a topography standpoint. And it's a fairly small area, tight, it's just so many things going on, just for me. Having been in around lots of mountain ski area type development stuff, that sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, and engineering always approves it, but sometimes it just plain sucks when it's built. I would just like to see what these expert authorities come up with their final opinions, and that's just me.
We're gonna need to step in just a second, but Tammy, I did have a question on something different on the
Mhm.
townhome section. There's mention of this, potential, or you actually say planning staff would recommend a waiver to the requirement dictating the land. And previously I'd read about, you know, this. It's kind of, I don't know, can you explain that part to me?
No, let's see here.
This street parcel dedication waiver, and you recommend a waiver required.
Oh, I see. typically with private roadways and the proposed roadways, and both of these are private, we record a document with language that states that at sometime in the future, when the county needs this to be public, it can be done.
Right,
This would be a waiver from that requirement. Planning and engineering don't foresee a need for these to be public right of ways. They're not.
okay, so this is a bit more of a, for lack of better terms, a gift to the developer, because I did read in the report, it talks about how typically these are private roads, but the public can use them in terms of throughway access or something like that, but they are private roads. And you are recommending a waiver saying what, that the state cannot eventually make them public, or that the public cannot use them as throughway access?
What it means is if it offers very little public benefit, number one, we would allow it without having to hold it to the street to the block requirements. That's stated in here. So we have block length requirements. If these were public right of ways, we would either have pathway or roadway stubs every so many 100 feet.
Okay,
We don't foresee enough of a public benefit to require that of the developer. The topography is challenging enough
Right.
that we don't even want them as public roads at this point.
and is that including trail and pathway and stuff like that?
Correct. Now, both of these, the CUP for the townhomes, the CUP for the condos, the conditional use permit asks for a pathway layout. The DRR1 zone for the townhomes also has a pathway requirement. So both of those are conditions of approval that they've got to submit a pathway layout prior to final approval. And that
And
is
that will
per
come to-
ordinance and previous approvals.
Okay. And that comes to her. Okay, we need to make our way into the other. I saw a text from Commissioner Morphy saying he plans to Zoom.
And I got something from Marty that said that, Sweppy and Schumann won't be here.
Okay, are we set up for Zoom with Commissioner Morphy? I mean, just now, he just.
Possibly.
I guess I'll call him like anyone else, I suppose.
Yeah, we can try.
Okay. Well, should we get the first one? Wait 1 second for the planning office to arrive. So good evening, we're going to call to order the meeting, the February 25th, 2025 meeting of the Ogden Valley Planning Commission. Thank you guys for attending and everyone online for attending as well. We'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, All right. This evening, we have 4 of the 7 commissioners in attendance in the auditorium. And I believe Commissioner Morby is online. Commissioner Morby, are you online? Can you confirm? And while I wait for Commissioner Morby to confirm, present in chamber is Commissioner Burton, Commissioner Frower, Vice Chair Barber, and Chair Wampler. Commissioner Morby, are you on Zoom? I see your name on Zoom. All right, Commissioners Schumann and Schweppe are excused this evening. First on our agenda are the minutes of January 28th, 2025. I believe we have some corrections for those.
So on page 4 of the minutes where it says Commissioner Schweppe, in that very last paragraph, it should say Commissioner Frohr. In that last paragraph where it's Commissioner Schweppe. On page 5, very last paragraph on the page, it should also say Commissioner Frohr instead of Commissioner Schweppe. On page 6, item number 3, where it says Commissioner Morley. In the second and third paragraphs, that should say Commissioner Frohr. And as discussed previously, Commissioner Morby had left the meeting at that point in time, and we did not vote on that issue. That would be my suggestion for corrections.
So on page 5, I didn't see, down at the bottom paragraph where it says Commissioner Schweppe.
Correct.
Okay, I would also suggest, I believe, above there, the 6th paragraph line, it says Commissioner Morby seconded the motion. I think that is also here.
That was mine. Yes, that's
So
correct.
that's also Commissioner Frower seconded the motion.
Yes.
And then Vice Chair Barber called for a vote. This is the 7th paragraph. Commissioner Morby is listed as voting. We need to strike his name. And the motion carried, needs to be changed on a vote of 4-1. There were 5 total votes. And just for reiteration, the next and last paragraph on that page, Schweppe is changed to Frower. The next page, as mentioned, paragraph under election of the 2025 chair and vice chair, where it says Commissioner Morby nominated Janet Wampler, change that to Frower. And where Morby votes, change that please in the chairman vote to Wampler. And in the vice chair vote, changing Commissioner Morby having nominated to Frower, and strike Morby from voting and put in please Commissioner Barber for the vice chair. And then those votes were still 6-0. Those are all of my corrections as well. Commissioner Burton? Anything? All right. Unless there are further changes, I will declare these minutes approved. All right. So first on our agenda, we have 2 administrative items. And Director Barber, would you like to reiterate the rules for
Yeah,
administrative items?
on these 2 items, you'll just be looking at the code, seeing if it applies with code or if it doesn't. And then making your recommendation based upon that. You're welcome to take public comment, but you're not required to. MSA law will be presented.
Yes, and just before she starts, letting people in the audience or online know that as Director Grover had stated, we are not required to take public comment. And it is important that the decisions and the votes do not take public comment into account. But with that said, I have made some precedent of taking public comment because we want to hear from people on the topics on the agenda as well as things that are not on the agenda, but also because whether or not we can take it into account on this item, it might help us to guide us for future rewriting of things, rewriting of ordinances or zones. And so therefore, I like to err on the side of listening to the public. But just please know that we cannot form a vote based off of the comment. So with that, we'll start with item 2.1, UVS011222.
Thank you, commissioners. This is going to look familiar because you've seen this a couple of times now. There have been some changes made to the road layout and in one instance to the lot layout. And anytime there's a change that's made that's more than minimal, this has to come back for a preliminary approval again, and that's why this is before you. This is a 6.885 acre piece in the FR3 zone, located at the top of Powder Mountain Road. The applicant is proposing a 60-unit development. This is a continuation. Hoping everyone can see this. This is a continuation of phase 1. So this would be Sundown Condos PRED phase 2. There is a conditional use permit associated with this application that was approved back in 1983. I want to mostly show where they've already got a preliminary approval based on the lot layout. The biggest change is their road layout. So our ordinance calls for a secondary egress when there are more than 15 dwelling units proposed on a road. And so this was initially what was proposed and approved conditionally by the Planning Commission back in January. This is what is being brought before you this evening. So in the last year, this is a good question that was brought up by the Planning Commission in the pre-meeting. What has occurred over the past year that's triggered this to come before you again? The applicant has since purchased the land to the west, and so in lieu of having to secure an easement, which was what was originally approved with this, they can now that they own the property, they can just plow a road through here. So the applicant is proposing, instead of 1, 2, 3 accesses into this development area, they've gone down to 2 to the preference of UDOT, frankly, and they're looking to connect this development with an additional development that will come before you later on the agenda. Because they're moving this road, they're changing the layout and frankly removing a 3rd access. This is before you for preliminary approval. You have a history of the development application in your staff report. To reiterate, here's a side-by-side. Sometimes it's easier to see it kind of right next to each other. Thank you very much for them. Yeah. This is your phase 1 that's been done already. These were the previous conditions of approval. One thing I wanted to mention was that typically when these are changed, an amendment to the conditional use permit is also required. However, per our ordinance, if the Planning Commission deems this to be a minimal change, then they can forgo that need to go back before you for an amendment approval to their CUP. So I've kind of highlighted this right here, just to let you know that they have gone back already for a preliminary approval, and the reason is because initially this second phase here was supposed to connect through this northern boundary of phase 1. Because of that significant change, they had to amend their CUP. Planning Commission will need to decide this evening if the change between these 2 layouts is significant enough that they need to amend their CUP, or if they can move towards the final approval without that step. So these are conditions from their previous preliminary approval back in 2024, January of 2024. We've asked that they get approval from UDOT for all of their accesses off of Powder Mountain Road, which are now down to 2 instead of 3. We've also asked that they address any concerns from engineering and Weaver Fire District regarding slopes and proposed roads within this, and that per their CUP, a proposed trail or pathway layout comes to us before final. These are the previous conditions of preliminary approval. Most of them carry over. What I have put on here that was mentioned in the Chair Vice Chair meeting last week. I put it in red. If the Planning Commission feels the need to have them show snow storage easements, this will be a requirement anyway from planning and engineering that these are shown on the final plat. However, to cover your bases, if you want to make that a condition of approval, you can do that. What I didn't put in here that was also mentioned was parking, additional guest parking. You can also make that a condition of your preliminary approval as well. And so these are the staff recommendations, the ones in black, any changes are in red, or anything to be highlighted. Do you have any questions for me?
And, this, so the entire Power Mountain development is on essentially a dead end road, right?
Yes.
And I understand that the county has ordinances or an ordinance that talks about what you can and can't build on a terminal, is that the right word, terminal?
That is, yep, on Terminal Street.
So, and I understand, there is a development agreement that covers the Powder Mountain development with that. I don't know if that was addressed or not, but in our previous discussions on these two potential developments, I haven't heard, or no one has asked yet about the Terminal Road situation and how this can be built on a terminal road when that ordinance exists in the county. Maybe I don't understand that ordinance correctly.
No, I think you do, and I think we're all on the same page about that being a terminal road. You are correct, there is a development agreement that specifically asks for secondary egress off the mountain. What isn't specifically stated in that development agreement is the trigger for that. I will tell you, over the past at least couple of years, Director Grover and myself and other planning staff have been in discussions with Powder Mountain frequently about securing that secondary egress. They know that we are wanting to see that. And frankly, additional development that they've done at the end of Summit Pass Road have all been private roadways. It does not, it doesn't waive that requirement for secondary egress. But we are in negotiations for that, I guess.
This isn't Powder Mountain doing, this is a different developer.
Correct.
These are whatever, 80 more units going up a dead end road. I guess that, maybe explain why that code exists and if this is just plain sidestepping that code or if there's some other issue with this developer aside from the Powder Mountain development where there's a resolution at some point.
It's definitely not sidestepping the code. The code was set up to allow internal circulation and we go off of the fire district on their recommendations, similar to the Ogden Valley, could be considered a terminal road coming up Ogden Canyon or so. We're working with the fire district. We may with them, we're looking at either a fire station or another access. Their biggest concern is not the access per se, because if there's a fire up there right now, if we had another access, they wouldn't want us to use that in the summer months because there's more fuel in that area. They'd probably want them to shelter in place up in the parking lot area during that time frame. And they want to have a station up there before they have that access. And so we're working with them on that. And we haven't came to an official determination on that yet. They have tentatively indicated that when it goes over X amount of lots, that they would like to see that. They're still trying to tie down that number. The commercial building that goes in place, that is, they're pretty specific that if it's a hotel or something like that, then the fire station goes into play. So that's what they're looking at right now, as far as the safety.
So all of that is with Powder Mountain. And I understand those discussions being done with the agencies in Powder Mountain. The way I'm hearing, Commissioner Barber's question being that this is a separate applicant. And I believe it's 15 lots on a terminal street, is that correct? I think that's the triggering thing. We've had to happen in other discussions of other, proposals. How does this applicant on that same terminal road that everything else is on as well, but has this, in these new
So
numbers.
we're not looking at the Powder Mountain Road as a terminal road. Right now, they have 2 access points coming out from the development
Okay,
onto that. So that's what we're looking at with this one.
so you're not looking at Powder Mountain Road, you're looking at in and out of the neighborhood.
Correct. But on a bigger scale, with Powder Mountain, we are looking at either another access or a fire station
Right.
up in that area.
And does something like another 80 homes that aren't related to Powder Mountain, but happen to be kind of commingled in the landed area, does that factor into this discussion?
It does, but our fire district has said that they're fine with it. So that's what we go off of.
And will this developer have to contribute to either a secondary road or a fire station or anything like that?
No. That's not part of the development agreements with Powder Mountain. So that's why I brought Powder Mountain up. This is not part of an improvement district or anything like that.
So there's other land up there that's not owned by Powder Mountain as well. If somebody else wants to put the development up there, they won't have to contribute either to any of that infrastructure.
We would look at that time, but this one was not part of that.
And so you consider the 22 units that are coming before us the first time as part of some historic agreement?
It was part of an older agreement but they have been amending the conditional use permit associated with it. And right now they're looking at amending that again. And so that's within your purview. If you feel that this is significant, you could require them to go through the, conditional use process.
And in that process, could they be required to be financially responsible for some aspect of new infrastructure that has to be built?
The planning commission couldn't make that determination because you're not, that's not within your purview, but the county commission could.
And just so you know, if a road ends up being built, who right now is paying for that, going to pay for that secondary road?
The developer would be.
100%.
Depending on if there is some public benefit, the county might be, but typically we're not in the road business. So we don't have the funding or mechanisms. Most municipalities rely on development to put in roads.
This is Morby. I have a couple of questions. Tammy, could you turn it back to the last slide, please? Maybe the next slide, the one with the pictures. Yeah. So in phase 2, is that exit on the existing road?
When talking about this here,
No, where that arrow is pointing to, that exit right there. Yeah, that goes into phase 2, I think.
I think originally the developer labeled it phase 3. This is a separate development that is on the agenda for preliminary approval this evening. And so if these are both approved, then yes, this will connect through here and come back out onto Powder Mountain Road down to the south.
And the reason I'm asking is that other exit that you first pointed to up on the top, that's a significant hill. And they're cutting back, but if they only have one access in and out of there, which would be that one, I don't know if engineering is considered how complicated that'll be. It's pretty significant hill right there on that exit. And if they're gonna come in that way all the time, that might be a problem. I know they're cutting back like a switchback there, but still it's potential.
think that engineering has been in many discussions with the developer. The developer is proposing retaining walls along here. As you can see, and ultimately county engineering will look at those engineered plans along with UDOT.
Okay,
The developer does have to get final approval for those before they can get final approval of the development.
so right now it looks like there's only one access in and out for construction.
However, the developer, Commissioner Morby, does own this property to the west.
I just feel more comfortable with an access lower on where the grade is a little bit not as steep. But it doesn't look like they'll have access to that for a while.
If I'm not mistaken, the other access is to the south, Tammy, that already exists because of the phase one of the project.
Correct.
Yeah. Does that make you feel any better, Commissioner Warren?
I was just voicing my concerns.
No, understood. It's not in this picture because it's not in today's application. Either one of the two that are in today's agenda, but there is already an existing phase one of the development that has road access. And that, I believe, and Tammy can confirm, is the access point down below that they will be coming in and out of as well. That one exists. They'd be building the one up top. And I agree with your concerns. We've seen this application in a number of different times, and as the planning staff mentioned, they've made some changes, but each time it's come before us, the planning commission has expressed concerns over the difficulty of the elevation, the slope, access in and out, snow removal, parking, which I'll bring up in a minute, but there's a number of concerns we have. But I can speak for myself that when I've met now with the engineering department and I've asked a number of questions, my concerns are somewhat allayed in the fact that A, I am not an expert in both engineering or fire safety and road studies, but UDOT, the county engineering, and the fire department are, and in the findings, should this move forward to approval, it requires all of those departments to have detailed final approval sign off. So while I look at it and I get nervous, I can rest assured that the experts will be the ones to make the determination. I do want to mention, Tammy, and I know I've expressed this before, I still do, whenever I see this application, have concerns over parking. As I understand it, these units that we're looking at right now have 2 garage parking. And it correlates to, I guess, 2 bedrooms.
It doesn't correlate to bedroom count. Our ordinance simply states for any dwelling, a minimum of 2 off-street parking spaces is required.
But there are 2 garage spaces. But I don't see any street parking. And while I just expressed concern over snow removal and being able to plow and where that snow is gonna go, I know with the phase one of the project, the original one that's been in existence for a while now, you have guests over, people have guests over, you know, more so than the people who just own the unit, and cars will come in. And my great concern is that without any guest parking allotted, even just 3 spots in some of these straightaways or somewhere, My concern is that people will make their own parking. And then that will really cause problems with fire safety and snow removal. That's my concern, it's just that guests of the owners or anything like that will eventually park on the street, causing more of a safety hazard.
And I think the reality is, if you look at these units, the garages aren't tall. And that's the way these units are typically designed. So pretty much any vehicle with a ski box on top won't fit. Any sport utility vehicle that's lifted even a little bit, even with a ski rack, won't fit. And I've seen that before in every other ski community that I've looked at. So that's a reality. They have to have, in my opinion, for it to be functional and safe, they have to have parking other than the garages, because those garages won't work for every vehicle that comes up there. And if there's going to be nightly rental in here, then, you're gonna have who knows coming up. It's not going to be people familiar with it, so they're not gonna adjust their vehicle size based on renting a condo for a few days. And there will be cars parked all over, I'll guarantee that. There are today, if you go up there and just look at the existing units that are up there, on a busy weekend, there's cars parked all over up there.
The developer is here to address any of your concerns as well.
So you say there are 2 parking spaces per unit required.
Correct.
Are there required dimensions for these parking spaces?
We do have minimum dimension requirements in our ordinance, and I think it's an 8 by 9, I believe.
A footprint, right?
Correct.
How about Commissioner Barber's concern about height?
It can't be 8 by 9. 9 by 18.
Oh, 9 by 18, thank you, sorry.
9 by 18 is the footprint.
Correct.
And then, do we have a height?
We don't have a height, they are required to have 2 off-street parking spaces, they don't have to be within a garage.
And is that in addition to the garage parking?
That is per
That is-
dwelling unit, so if they wanted all of their parking to be in a parking lot, they may be able to do that.
So no height or anything like that, because you don't require it to be a garage, it could be anywhere.
Right,
So you
just
just
have-
have the footprint.
Correct.
So that a condition that could be added to this preliminary approval would be that the height of these parking spaces is enough to accommodate typical ski vehicles. I mean, it's gotta be taller than an 8-foot garage. Is that something we can do?
You just wanna make the right findings in order to require that, because that's going above and beyond the code. To do that, but as part of the conditional use permit, it does talk about parking and safety. And you could look at it, as part of the conditional use review.
Okay, so if we have a finding that typical ski vehicles coming to utilize these dwelling units would be a certain height. The condition is that these garages be designed to accommodate that height of the vehicle.
I think that could possibly work. Corbin, what's your thoughts?
I agree that if you are in a situation where you're dealing with a conditional use permit, then you are allowed to put those conditions on there if you have findings to support it. And if it's something that the ordinance allows you to do. If it were just a regular subdivision approval that was not a conditional use permit, you'd have to just look at the ordinances the way they are. And the reason you can do it with a conditional use permit is because state law allows it, and county ordinance also allows it for conditional uses if there are findings that support the need for that. And this is a conditional use permit.
It is, and right now, if you were to start looking at the height of the garages and things like that, you may want to consider this more than a de minimis change and have them address those things, if those are concerns that you see. That's a risk that, developer takes when they come and they do amendments to different conditional uses, there could be other things that are looked at.
Can I just clarify something? So this application is a subdivision that is under a conditional use permit. So while they're not looking at changes to their CUP, they are looking at changes to they are looking for preliminary approval for a subdivision. So if you feel that you need to require any amendments to their conditional use permit, then we can certainly have them submit that application and bring that before you.
Yeah, because right now, the road access was approved under the previous conditional use permit. Is that?
Correct.
The first finding is a CUP amendment application shall be submitted addressing changes in the proposed. It says building location, roadway layout. Could we not add language?
If you feel that it's de minimis, then you can continue on with this, but if you feel like the conditional use permit needs to be, that this is not de minimis, then you need to come back and address that, but as part of the subdivision, you can't, I think you're on shaky grounds if you start putting in height requirements, on garages. But if you tie it to the conditional use permit, like Cortland and I have indicated, then you could look at some of those things if that's.
Right, is that not what I'm saying? So the current finding of the staff recommendation mentions, the very first one says, a CUP amendment application shall be submitted addressing changes in proposed building location and roadway layout. Those are the changes they're submitting tonight. If we agree that it's still de minimis, can we just add the language there
You could.
about height? And just that way it's just already put in there about the CUP amendment and just add it there.
Yep, that would be appropriate. If that's what you're, if that's what you want.
I don't know if you're the right person to answer this question, but is there space in the development to have off-site, not in front of these condos or townhouses, to create a parking area for guests?
It looks like there would be, but that's probably a better question for the developer. And I'll go back to their better picture of their layout here. I mean, I don't know. That would be a question for the developer, I think.
And another question maybe you don't answer is, where are they gonna move the snow? Do they have to have a place to put the snow to clear these parking areas? Is that part of what we're supposed to look at?
So typically, especially in this area over here at Powder Mountain, and especially on private roads, but everywhere, we do ask that snow easements be shown on their final plat. So we know where that snow is gonna be stored. They haven't shown it on this very preliminary concept plan, but it was mentioned in the chair vice chair meeting last week, and that can certainly, in fact, I have that here as an additional condition of approval if you feel that's appropriate.
She doesn't have it in the packet, but it was on the screen.
Right.
Does anyone have any questions at the moment for Tammy specifically? And if not, I'll invite the applicant up to answer questions as well. Thank you. Good evening.
Questions?
You are,
I'm
Yes.
Guy Williams. I'm a civil engineer and owner's rep.
For this application. So what is the height of the garage? Because I'm trying to look at, I know we have
So-
some.
The ceiling height, I'm not sure what the garage door height is, but the ceiling height is actually pretty high because of the stepping of the units. We're actually 12 feet high, sometimes at 14 feet high.
For the garage?
I'm not sure what
For the ceiling.
the ceiling, I'm not sure what the garage door opening is. I can find that out, but I didn't reconsider that. I can answer your concern about guest parking.
Yes.
Can we go back to that main picture? Yeah. Perfect. So I guess to kind of explain why we're here again is we did have two access points, one right there where the red square is. And then the developer, the owner bought this triangular piece that is on the agenda for later tonight. So we were able to eliminate the access road that goes through heading northwest in that square, per UDOT recommendations, they didn't want a third access point. Reason I bring that up is because we have allocated space there for guest parking because we know it's gonna be an issue. And so the idea is to put a guest parking lot there. I'm not sure the density we can get. But parking is a concern of ours as well. And so there will be guest parking there. Like I said, I'm not sure how many we're gonna get there. And then the snow storage is also a concern that we're trying to address. So there's ample places for snow to go.
And so when you say there, you mean in that red box?
In that red box, exactly. Yeah, where that third access was going to be, will now be parking. And we haven't added it to this because that was discussed essentially while we were trying to apply for this. So, but we do plan on guest parking.
You do, so you're open to that, so if it became a finding for before final approval with George Grover that you are.
Well, whether or not it becomes a finding, we are gonna put guest parking.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Anybody have any questions?
And again, that, so if you want in either direction from that red box, does those adjoining roads either go up or down, or once you get on, do you envision it being reasonably flat where the buildings are gonna be?
Yeah, in between the two main groups of buildings, north to south, there's a main bulk right in the middle. That road is at 3.5% sloping to the east. So it's a fairly minimal road and it does follow the contours of the mountain. And the same goes for the building located to the upper right. The road in front of that is at 3 to 3.5%. It's where the connecting pieces of the road where it does get steep, and then we've been in discussions with the fire department. Their maximum is 10%, which we've met in our preliminary engineering design.
Just so that you said this top road here with the 3 dual units, is that what you're saying? Is also a 3?
Right in front of the units is
also a 3?
3.5%. Correct. It follows the contours as well, right there.
Will there be any guest parking up by what you just described, those 3 units on the right side of that?
I would like there to be. I'm not sure. We haven't laid it out, designed it yet, and done engineering to it. We can definitely push that way and make sure there's some guest parking allocated up there as well. Because I understand that in the red boxes, I definitely removed a satellite parking lot for them. So that is something we can look into and would probably include anyway.
So snow storage has been mentioned a couple times, in your engineering work, it's not shown here that I can see. Have you designated snow storage areas?
We haven't yet designated specific snow storage areas. Right now, what we're looking at is a preliminary site plan. And we are aware that we need to do that, and removing that third access point has facilitated that as well. Created more space so we can do snow storage.
And would you envision multiple storage locations, or would you envision moving the snow around within the whole thing?
No, I would envision there's gonna be about 4 different snow locations. One to the north of the 3 duplex that you mentioned earlier. One to the south of it, and then one to the east of the main body of units, and one to the west of the main body.
Anyone else have any further questions for the applicant?
Can you address these retaining walls along Powder Mountain Road?
Sure.
Do they have slope on them, or are they straight up and down? But
They do have an angle to them. It is designed by, well, they're vertiblock, and so they do have a batter to them. They're at an angle. It's kind of like Legos, giant Legos that are 3 feet long and 2 feet tall, with a reinforced fiber that goes back into the soil for anchoring. But they do have a batter angle on them. I'm not sure what it is. It's probably around 5%, so they're not completely vertical, but they are fairly steep, and I would say almost vertical.
what kind of protection would be installed along the highway there to keep
We do have
people
guardrails
with
shown.
cars from going on?
Yeah, we do have guardrails shown on one of them. It's a darker line along the top and it's not specifically called out in this site plan. But as you go further into the engineering documents, we do have a guardrail called out on the ones that are concerning.
So would that be adequate to actually stop a vehicle coming down that steep road from going through the guardrail and over there?
That's a good question, and I've looked at the code about vehicle guardrails, and I can't find a section of code that stipulates we need them there. And that's what we rely on is the code. Just so there's not all these ancillary requests. And for budgeting purposes and for safety reasons, so. I'm not aware of a section of code that stipulates we need anything there due to the grade on Powder Mountain Road. We have presented in front of UDOT, and they haven't raised any requests for that either.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One last call out. Anybody have any further questions for the applicant? All right, thank you very much.
Commissioners, can I, before anyone sets a motion, can I just make a recommendation that if you would like to ensure that parking is put in, I would include it as a recommendation for your preliminary approval.
As a recommendation. A finding. A finding within the motion, is that what you mean?
An additional recommendation, if you guys want to make sure that the applicant has parking within the development for their final approval, I would recommend you include it as a condition of approval.
Okay.
Where it's not already called out in the staff recommendation.
Any discussion amongst the commissioners or further questions for staff?
Last slide back up, please.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Jim Wolfer, could I ask for a little bit of clarification again as to the conditional use permit versus the subdivision application? Because as I read through here, it talks about a conditional use approval dated August 27th, 2024. And so we aren't actually dealing with a conditional use permit amendment here tonight. It's a conditional use permit was already granted or amended in August, and now this subdivision is being proposed under the conditional use permit or within the boundaries of the conditional use permit that was already approved, is that right?
Well, let me clarify actually. Typically there would be an amendment to the conditional use permit, and then you would see the subdivision come before you. In this case, the applicant wanted preliminary approval for their subdivision. So that came before the Planning Commission in January, conditioned upon an amendment to their CUP being submitted and approved by the Planning Commission. So that's why those two are out of order, Cortland. So the subdivision preliminary approval for the previous road layout.
That was the one that was approved last January.
Correct, that was approved in January, and then the conditional use permit that allowed for that change was approved in August of that year. Now we're coming back with this new change. And the request from staff is that if the Planning Commission feels that this change in road layout here is more than minimal, that they may be able to ask the developer to come back to amend their CUP as well. If they feel it's a minimal change, then we can move forward with this preliminary approval and go to final approval without having to amend their conditional use permit. Did I explain that okay?
But I'm still now confused, is the first condition under staff's recommendation states a CUP amendment application shall be submitted. So we have a new one being submitted, is that correct?
No, not yet, not unless you feel that this is more than minimal. So it shall be submitted if the planning commission determines that these changes are more than minimal. And I apologize if that wasn't written as clearly as it could have been written.
So let me ask this question,
I didn't see that.
to clarify that in my mind. So I know we have two applications on the agenda tonight. They're separate, but they use the same roadway, they use the same parking issues, there's a lot of, same retaining wall, all the infrastructure appears to be the same, but they're two different developments under two different applications. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. So in my mind, it is more than minimal because back then, last year, there was one development that had the road layout. Now there's two developments conjoined using the same road, the same retaining walls, the same everything. So it makes the whole process or the whole project, even though they're two separate parts, more complicated, more significant. It puts the risk higher in every category, in my observation. Am I looking at that wrong? I know there's two, but it's really one, when you consider the road, the topography, the snow, the retaining walls, all of those factors, it is one development. But it's two applications, two phases, multiple phases, I know that.
I'm not quite sure how to answer that. I don't know. I mean, would this question be the same if we had two different owners, two different developers? One of them is subject to a conditional use permit. The other one is not. It's actually subject to the Powder Mountain Development Agreement. We would require any adjacent properties. We would require that interconnectivity regardless of whether the ownership was the same or not. So even if we had two different developers, the first thing we often discuss with developers when they come in with a proposal showing stubbed roads to adjacent properties is, have you worked with the adjacent property owner? Have you talked to them? How is this going to continue through? So we would require some kind of connectivity through there anyway, but I understand your point, Commissioner, and that's certainly within your purview to require. And Commissioner, or rather Director Grover and Cortland, if you feel that maybe there isn't a whole lot of discretion for the Planning Commission to waive that requirement to amend their CUP, I don't know. Maybe that's something for you to address.
The code for an amendment of a conditional use permit, talks about, let's see, I was looking at that just a second ago. It says that in the event a change is anticipated from the originally approved proposal or conditions of the original approval, an amendment to the original conditional use permit shall be required as provided herein. The thing is, that is probably talking about the applicant asking for a change. If they're asking for a change to those conditions, they need to request an amendment, I believe is what that is saying. Unless, and this is down further in the code section, if it's a de minimis revision, which just means a minimal inconsequential revision, then that may be approved by the planning director, provided it can be determined that the changes are slight, inconsequential, and not in violation of any substantive provision of this code. So there is some discretion there for the planning director to approve those minimal changes. Otherwise, it would need to come back to the planning commission for approval of an amendment, it looks like. But my question is, if there is anything that would change the conditions attached to the conditional use permit, I don't know if that's something that the planning commission, just on its own without an application to change that, can just impose with a subdivision application that comes along, unless you determine, I think that the subdivision application is actually requiring a change to the conditional use permit, this maybe more than minimal, which I think is what Tammy has been saying all along. If you determine that this change to the subdivision application is necessarily changing the conditions that were approved with the conditional use permit, then I think what she's saying is you can require them to go back and make an amendment application for the conditional use permit. Otherwise, if it's minimal
Before you
enough,
go on, Courtney, can we say to make a change to the CUP and include designation for the guest parking and include the heights of the garage entry, those kinds, can we do that at this point?
my question there would be, is that a part of the conditional use permit or is that part of the subdivision application? Which application are those things tied to?
See, I think those things can only be tied to the conditional use permit. I don't think you can tie the height of the garages to the subdivision. And what you're indicating, I'm kind of feeling like they need to amend the CUP. If you want to put those things in there, I just don't feel like you could just put those in the subdivision, because the subdivision ordinance isn't going to have, you're not going to have the ability to add those as part of the subdivision review. It would just be under the conditional use review.
Right, but the CUP would not be something that they're asking to have amended unless the road layout was a critical part of that.
Correct.
So that's what has to be determined is, are they asking for something that requires the CUP to be amended because it's a significant enough change? If all they're asking for is the road layout, if that is considered to be a significant enough change, then you can say they have to go back and request an amendment to the CUP. And if that happens, then you can add additional conditions. I think if they're within the boundaries of the code, this is really confusing, I think, but
It is.
because of the sort of multi-layered type of application that these old PRUDs were. But I think if you determine that the road layout is a de minimis change that doesn't require a change to the CUP, then I would recommend against adding other conditions like the height of the garage,
Okay,
the parking.
I have a question then. So if I'm just to look at the road, to be able to determine if it's de minimis or not, and then go from there. The way that this is broken out into two separate applications, the difference in, be careful with what I'm saying here, but the difference that I see right away in this particular application, well, the major road difference is in the next application item. That is dramatically different.
But that's not part of the CUP.
I understand.
So the
So,
I mean, the reason I think it's significantly different is because originally these 60 condo units, they had an entrance and an exit purely for those units. And it was pretty straightforward. Went around this sharp bend and went straight through and went straight out.
right,
Now, they have to go through a significantly more dense development of those condo units or townhouse units around more turns to get out a different direction than was originally planned. So if there are gonna be parking problems, if there's gonna be snow blockages, if there are gonna be all those issues, it's probably going to happen more down in those townhouse areas, which is the second way out, or actually the first way. If you're coming up from the bottom, you're coming up Powder Mountain Road and you're going to one of your condos over there, you're probably gonna take that first turn. You're gonna want to, especially if you're a renter coming up for the weekend, you're gonna take that first turn. And it's gonna put you through a whole bunch of density and potential problems and risk areas that wasn't part of the plan originally. But now it is. So I do see it as this road change significant, because now you're going through a whole different neighborhood of other challenges and density versus just going straight in one way or the other. Which was previously approved. So I do see it as more than just, a minimal change. And, you know, when you factor in all those safety risk issues, it even becomes more significant in my mind.
I got an observation. If I just look at this first item before us, and the maps that are on the screen now, the before and now. Well, the buildings haven't changed. There are 2 entrances and exits. The only thing that's changed is instead of going back on the highway, we just make a connection to a different place. That gives us the 2 ins and outs for this item. I looked, well, what would happen if, what's this thing it's dumping into? Is that phase 3? Okay. Phase 3 is already there. It's already got county made a stub in a road there. I'm just pretending.
Oh, right.
Okay, if that stub were there for connectivity or whatever, and this developer said, well, you know, I just soon connect my exit on that stub and not go out on the highway. That'll be safer. You've always, I know UDOT wants to minimize the number of roads connecting into a highway. So if I look at it that way, well, to me, it's kind of de minimis, because all you're doing is changing a little piece of the road to connect at a different place. It's not connecting on the highway, it's connecting to a little stub. Okay, so I could kind of see either way. Now, if I convince myself this is de minimis because all we're doing is taking a little tail here and putting them on the road exiting, we're not changing anything else in the whole subdivision. Okay. It can be argued that that's not a big deal. It's an exit, it's just going out a different place. Okay, now that frees up the area where it used to go out and connect to the highway. So second, this is my question. This is here for subdivision preliminary approval. We've got to look at it and say, okay, are they meeting all the code requirements for parking? Now there are 2 requirements for a garage, two spaces per dwelling unit for owner parking.
Correct.
Occupant parking. Is there any requirement under the subdivision code for guest parking?
For residential use, no.
Okay, is this going to be, is it residential use if it's nightly rentals?
That would be more of a commercial use, and that's typically looked at by code enforcement.
Okay, so is it intended that they have nightly rentals here?
There's a possibility, but if they were to do nightly rentals, the bedroom is what limits how many parking stalls are required. So depending on what they have going on there, when they apply for a business license, their parking would dictate how much could be used for nightly rentals.
Okay. I'm just trying to simplify in my mind this deal. How can it work? Seems to me, if this is gonna be people coming in with vehicles, they might not be able to get in the garage. Well, where are they gonna park? Whether we go with the original out onto the highway exit to the southwest, or we go through the stub that comes in from somewhere else. We still got a problem with where people with large vehicles gonna park. And so could we, in looking at this, say, hey, we gotta have some guest parking out here outdoor to accommodate X number of ski vehicles that come up here.
Or we could only do that as part of the conditional use permit in my mind.
Okay, and that requires us saying we gotta have a amendment to the conditional use. Okay.
So I do have to say, when I look at these pictures, my first thought, I think resembles what you mentioned, where if you just look at this application in those pictures, it doesn't immediately look like a huge change in the road because you just kind of lowered it a little bit because that plat stops, not necessarily plat, but that boundary stops for this application. And you've lowered it a little bit. But where I think Commissioner Barber put proper words to is that it made, in terms of say, fire safety, exiting access, it went from a direct line, right? Basically a right in and out to get straight to your home for any kind of emergency situation, to now, and although this is not on this application, but in order to exit, it went from a straight line to a long and winding road that could change the health and safety response time.
The developer has provided and worked with the fire district, and Tammy may want to mention this about the fire exiting plan and the radius plan that they submitted.
But I just feel like that for me, that difference of, I know we spoke pretty extensively in previous meetings when we were discussing this application of there needing to be, I think we discussed 3 exits at the time because there was a potential for a phase 3 that was just kind of theoretically talked about, but not shown to us. And there was this exit, so there was a nice in and out of phase 2, 2 different in and outs that were direct to that development. The way that this road has changed, I'm falling on the side that it is not de minimis because the exit is no longer that accessible.
Let me ask the same question. So there's been a fire at Powder Mountain, burned quickly. And supposedly one of the reasons they couldn't deal with it, the fire department that approved the development up there had to let it burn to the ground, was that the fire hydrants were buried in snow. At least that's what I read and heard someone say. I'm just curious, in a development like this, I assume there'll be fire hydrants.
I would assume so.
And whose responsibility is it to keep those accessible? Is that the developer, the HOA, the fire department, the county? Who has to dig those out?
This would be the HOA that would be
Responsible for digging those out.
Mhm.
So Powder Mountains, HOA was responsible, they didn't do it. And that's why they had that major loss, if that's what happened.
I can address
Yeah.
that situation with this one.
Okay. Yeah, all right, so again, snow storage and the density and the related challenges in my mind with this road make this whole situation more complicated than the last time I saw it, even though it is 2 separate developments for sure.
I'm coming to the conclusion that if you just look at that road change, it's de minimis. The parking, the guest parking and heights and all that other stuff. That's certainly an issue. But it's not related to changing the location of this exit. You just look at it all by itself. All we want to change is it's not going to the highway, it's making a left turn right onto the stub. Okay, that's not a big deal. We got 2 entrances, 2 exits. We're there. Now this whole thing of parking. That should have been or should be addressed somehow, somewhere, if there's a need for guest parking outdoors for ski vehicles. That's not related to whether the road goes out onto the highway or onto the stub.
Yeah, I would concur with that. But I also concur with Commissioner Barber. I think you both have valid points. It could be either considered de minimis, or it could be considered a major change. And how you look at this, I think there's opportunities on both sides for the applicants to screen. You know, I'm sure they don't want that, but I can see how you guys are looking at that.
What about the fact that we went from 3 exits to 2?
Pardon?
What about the fact that we were going from 3 exits to 2?
I understand that's a requirement or request of UDOT.
Yeah, UDOT wouldn't allow for that other access, and so that's why they went down to 2. And Tammy, correct me if I'm speaking out of turn here, but that's why we have the 2, and that's why we've been working with the fire district on this.
But so how should that be taken into account in terms of looking at whether it's de minimis or not?
I would take into account the fire district and rely upon their recommendation and the engineering division, because they're the professionals.
Unless we want to substitute our judgment, which is.
Which is not what I'm suggesting. What I'm asking is if for me, if I'm looking at weighing de minimis versus not, based on, it used to be a straight through entrance and exit for those units over there, and now it is not. And if that is what pushes me towards, this is not de minimis. But then if you're saying you shouldn't necessarily take that into account because it was the fire department and they did, or UDOT did not want that road, UDOT has told them not to do that, so that is no longer applicable in looking at it. For that to be a factor for me of de minimis or not, then I want to know that.
Yeah, the UDOT has said no to the 3rd access.
Okay,
UDOT's not, they don't care if it's a de minimis change or not, they're just looking at it from their perspective.
Correct.
The de minimis aspect wasn't even part of that.
No,
no, that I understand, but I'm asking from advice from the planning office on whether it is appropriate to still use that in my decision of de minimis if it was ordered by UDOT.
I would. My biggest concern is if you're trying to go back to the conditional use permit to add additional conditions that should have been addressed when the conditional use permit was issued, I think that's wrong.
That's not what I'm doing.
If you are saying that it's de minimis, based upon it's just shifting the road down, then I would base it solely upon the road. Or if you're wanting to say that it's a major change, base it solely upon the road. Only look at the road as your reasoning for determining that.
So okay, so I'm on record having said, if I just look at the boundary of this application without the entrance and exit port, the one with the big red line staring at me, if I just look at it up to the original boundary, then what I see is we have shifted the road to the south a little bit, and that alone, within the boundary line, I don't believe is greater than de minimis, right? Is not de minimis. But that road in the original CUP, we had the understanding that was going to be an exit. And so I shouldn't just look at the boundary line because we approved things based off of that being an exit, and it is no longer an exit, and now the exit is a very long and winding road. Which then is a big change to me. Right. Okay, so I was looking for advice on if it wasn't because the applicant wants to change it, it's because UDOT said we don't want that exit. Am I still able to say, well, that still made a big change compared to before, or do I not hold that against?
No, you could use that as justification in my mind as I look at that.
Okay. And I'm not looking for justification, I'm not trying to finagle something, I just, that is having a straight entrance and exit is a big difference from what we have now. I'm not trying to get somewhere, that is a difference for me. I just want to know if it's wrong to use that, if it wasn't up to the applicant, it was UDOT that made them change that.
UDOT did make them change that. from my understanding. Is that correct, Tammy?
I believe so. Is that? Yes.
And I would agree that that doesn't impact the analysis of whether or not it's de minimis, because they could have come in with a particular layout, and it could have been, you know, understood that UDOT was going to review it, and maybe UDOT's review made them change things so much that they had to change the whole layout of the subdivision in an obviously not minimal way. And then we would still say that's not a de minimis change, regardless of what caused it.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
So I want to go forward. Hypothetically. Okay. Now we're gonna look at a CUP amendment. Because of this road change. Okay, so we're discussing. Well, this road change maybe makes this exit not straightforward, and maybe it's not safe. And now we're down to the question, who decides whether fire exit is safe or not? Is it we, or is it the fire department? So we're back to the same place. It's the fire guys that decide whether or not this is an adequate fire exit. And we've got in this thing, that our approval would be subject to the fire people giving their approval to the ingress egress for fire exit. So we're back at the same place, but we're probably 3 or 4 months later.
I think there's a bit of a difference though. Because number one, we're looking at the conditions that were put upon the conditional use at the time when we had this original egress. That is no longer the case, and it's up to us to decide if that is a big or small change. And with this change, based off of how the road now works and everything, there are potential more complications that we didn't account for in the CUP because that wasn't part of the plan before.
But ultimately, we're gonna have to require on engineering and fire
Absolutely.
to approve it. And we're already there. If we approve this, it's subject to engineering and fire deciding this is safe. So we don't need to go there. We're already there.
Look, fire, I can't sit here and say that this is a de minimis change when I'm looking at a road that now has a hairpin turn in it, that now goes through 3 different elements of additional density where there likely will be people parking in the street. And I like to think that this body exists to give these types of issues with public safety a very close look that fire may or may not. I mean, we know fire, you know, fire things, bad things happen, like already happened at Powder Mountain. And so I'm looking at this as a much more complicated situation when you don't have obvious parking situations taken care of. You don't have obvious snow removal taken care of. We don't know what the grades are in here. It just looks way more complicated than it did last year when it came through and basically a straight line in and out almost. To me, it's, you know, it's not anymore. It's not simple anymore. It's much more complicated. And with those other elements left off, I can't sit here and say that I feel comfortable with this at this point in time with all of these sort of loose ends hanging out there. That's my personal opinion.
I don't understand what we can,
What we're
going forward, we're gonna rely on fire and engineering ultimately, anyway. We just have to talk about it a whole bunch more. If we go back for a CUP amendment.
I think talking about it more is fine. Given the circumstances and the potential problems that could ensue.
I mean, unfortunately, I was thinking about the fire hydrant thing. What a shame. That they weren't shoveled out and they couldn't have been used. So do we require heaters around the fire hydrants so that they're never covered with snow, they're all melted? But then somebody forgot to turn the heater on. I don't know.
The reality is, this is an extreme circumstance. Everything at the Powder Mountain is extreme.
Yeah.
For sure. The weather, topography, the density in certain areas is extreme. And if, you know, if it's our job to try to be diligent and think about safety going forward, I have no problem spending a little more time doing that. Especially when I can see this being a very dense rental area where you've got people coming up, never been there before, or maybe haven't driven a whole lot up in that kind of an area. You know, my perspective, having lived in other ski towns, is that this is not abnormal, but it is extreme because of the way Powder Mountain is, because of the elevation, because of the way the weather comes and goes. Just all the circumstances that we see up there all the time, at least I do, that you've got to be careful, you've got to be diligent, and that's why I'm wasting my time sitting here, not wasting my time, but using my time sitting here, and I don't mind looking at this again once it's mapped out further, so that some of these unknowns become known. And then some tourist who's renting the unit for the weekend doesn't have to deal with it in a bad way. They get to go home that Monday morning or whatever.
Question. If, so, nightly rentals are conditional in this subdivision.
You know, they're permitted, they just need to meet certain requirements and go through and get a business license.
Okay, would one of the requirements be extra parking for?
It's based upon the bedrooms that they have, and so if they only have 2 parking spaces, that limits what they can use for nightly rentals.
How many bedrooms or how many
I
parking?
think it's 2. You need 2 bedrooms per parking stall. Do you remember, Tammy? I don't have the ordinance right from me.
As far as nightly rentals go, I can pull that up.
Yeah, it's based on bedroom count, and so that's what determines that. It really comes down to the amount of bedrooms they have.
But even still, it's, these are for sale, they'd be owner occupied, and if an owner wants to have a nightly rental, it's the owner's. So it's not like the owner can say, hey, we need guest parking in the development. It would just be the owner's.
Yeah, and then it comes down to enforcement. If they're parking in other areas, just like anywhere in the valley, then we go through the enforcement process. We had some of that with those smaller units by Wolf Creek, those single family homes, the small lots, and we would address that through enforcement. And they only had 2 parking spaces.
Chair, do we have? Seems like we're going around and around and around. Do you have enough information to make a motion?
Well, before we do that, I'd like to entertain a motion to open for public comment. See if there's anybody online or in the audience that would like to say anything related to this particular application issue. Would anybody like to make a motion to open public comment?
Do we have to have a motion for that? It's not a public hearing.
No? Oh, okay, wonderful. Is there anyone online or in the auditorium that would like to speak on this issue?
Guy Williams again, just a quick question.
And for the record, this is the applicant.
The applicant, yeah, speaking as a public, whatever that is. Quick question, I was under the impression that only the planning director could request the conditional use permit, or require that.
No, it can be deferred to the planning commission if the planning director doesn't feel comfortable doing that, and that's what's happened in this situation.
Okay, is that part of the code? I didn't hear that when you were reading that.
The code says the planning commission is the land use authority for conditional use permits. De minimis revisions to a previously approved conditional use permit may be approved by the planning director, provided it can be determined the changes are slight, inconsequential, and not in violation of any of the substantive provisions of this code. It doesn't say one way or another if the planning director has the authority specifically to send it back to the planning commission for determination on that point, but That's what he has chosen to do.
Okay, so that makes sense. Thank you for clarifying that. I want to appreciate all the candor. I just hope that we can see it as the project and not consider other developments or other aspects, such as parking that might have been missed before as part of this decision. So, thank you.
Thank you. I don't see any hands up online. So, and nobody's standing up in the auditorium anymore, so I'm gonna go ahead and close public. If there is found to be, if it's found to be de minimis or not, how do we, like, so one of your questions was we need to make that decision, how do we present that?
Well, you can either condition your preliminary approval upon the applicant coming back for an amendment to their CUP.
Okay.
You can always table it until they do come back for an amendment to the CUP. That option adds an additional step for the applicant, but if it, adds another level of comfort for the planning commission, that can certainly be a motion.
Okay. So under the staff recommendation, this first one that at first I didn't see was dependent on us finding that it is more than minimal. That would then, in the case where we condition an approval on coming back as amendment to the CUP, that would kick in. Is that
Correct.
Is that right with the wording? Okay. Okay, does anyone have any more questions for staff or the applicant?
And just an observation, I'm looking at these layouts for these units, and they appear to me to be 3 living stories, and so it appears just drawn in here are 5 beds per unit, including the loft. So when just in thinking through the parking situation and the realities of if these do go into nightly rental or not, keeping the roads clear of extra vehicles. So am I looking at this right? 5 beds in these units that are in this drawing?
I would probably defer to the applicant to confirm that. I do have information from specific to parking regarding short-term rentals. If you'd like me to give you that information. In the short-term rental ordinance, which is chapter 108, title 11, parking is not permitted within the adjacent right-of-ways, which fire is not allowing parking within the right-of-ways anyway. And at least 1 parking space measuring 9 by 20 shall be provided for each 2 sleeping rooms offered. The capacity or the number of people allowed in there is at the discretion of code enforcement or whoever's issuing that business license based upon whether they feel that the parking is sufficient. Their business licenses for short-term rentals are pretty specific as far as the maximum number of guests. And this short-term rental ordinance outlines the maximum number per room. And so our code enforcement may look at those number of bedrooms, look at the parking, and if they have more sleeping area than parking spaces, then they could be capped at the number of guests or vehicles of that.
I'm sorry, you said the code for the short-term rental is a 9 by 20 per 2 sleeping rooms, but earlier you stated that under the current ordinance of this, it's 9 by 18.
That's just the regular for a single family residence. So if they're doing nightly rentals, then they need the 9 by 20.
Right, so, and I'm not sure if they're building bigger, but that's the minimum for the residents. So if the developer sticks to the minimum, they wouldn't even.
Right, so hopefully they plan for the 9 by 20. If they haven't, then they can't do nightly rentals.
Okay.
Because they don't meet that requirement.
Right, because then they couldn't do it. Do we know what the actual size of the garage area is?
I don't have that information right in front of me.
May ask the applicant.
Do you, I'm sorry, off the top of your head, no?
Top of my head, no, I don't have the architecture plan
That's
memorized.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, I'll entertain a motion.
I'll make a motion. I move that with regard to file number UVS011222. This is item 1 on the agenda, that we approve preliminary subdivision, we give grants preliminary subdivision approval for Sundown Condominiums Phase 2. And that's based upon the findings in the staff report, was an additional finding that the road connection change is de minimis. And therefore a CUP amendment application is not necessary due solely to the road change. This is subject to the conditions shown in the staff report.
Do we have a second?
I would like to add something to your motion. I would like to add that I agree with what you're proposing, but I would like to add that they come back with an amendment, the CUP amendment showing the guest parking and the snow, where they're gonna place the snow. And with that, approval from engineering and from the fire department, I agree.
Do you accept that?
Yeah, I accept it. So my finding was that it's de minimis, but as a condition of this approval, what Commissioner Forrest stated will be a requirement.
So
I
I just wanted, my main point would be to make sure it's clear on the record what that was, and I know he stated it. So what
I want to approve, but I want it subject to a CUP amendment outlining where the guest parking will be and where they're gonna dump the snow.
So my question to that would be whether that really requires a CUP amendment or whether that is something that would just be shown on the subdivision plans or plat.
I think Director Grover said we
couldn't do that.
the subdivision wouldn't be able to require that.
I think when you're looking at the building, garage heights and things like that, that's part of the CUP, but you probably could require that as part of the subdivision. It's a little bit of a stretch.
But you didn't, as I heard, require any specific number or anything like that. You just asked that it be shown on the plat, correct?
Because, yes, because I want them to show how many they think they can squeeze into this little area right on the corner in terms of guest parking. And up on the, I'm assuming it's the northeast end by where there are 3 units, where there would be additional guest parking.
Okay, so that would not be anything other than showing, tell me if I'm wrong, than showing on the final plat that's presented for final approval later, the guest parking plan and spots and the snow removal areas, and that's it, right?
Where they're going to remove the snow to, not the snow removal area, but where they're gonna put the snow in the guest parking, in the areas that they're gonna expect cars to be parked.
Okay. So my thought is that would not require any kind of CUP amendment. It would just be requirements that would be shown on the plat for final review.
I think we could do that.
Then if we don't need a CUP amendment, then I would remove that request to be included in the motion, that part of the request.
Okay.
It's the European amendment, but can I restate what I believe your motion was, or would you like to?
So I think Commissioner Burton said, he wants to approve this because the change in the road from straight to turn is not
Right,
significant.
it's not de minimis. my understanding was the motion was to approve this application, stating that it is not de minimis, it is de minimis, and therefore does not require a CUP amendment application.
Correct.
The friendly amendment was to add 2 additional findings, which were snow storage easements and areas to be shown on the final plat.
Well, it's not a finding, it's a
Condition, 2 additional conditions for this approval. One is the snow storage easements and areas to be shown on the final plat, as well as guest parking to be a condition of final approval and shown on the final plat.
Yes.
Did I get that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. And then
And with
that was
second,
Commissioner Frower seconding.
not sure.
Okay. All right. Is there any discussion on this? Okay. Sorry, I'm calling for a vote. I'm calling for a vote, on the motion to approve with all of that. If you wish to approve, say aye.
Aye.
Sorry, that was 2 to my.
Morby says aye.
Okay, so that is 3 to my left, and, any for nay?
I vote nay.
Nay. So that is a 3 to 2, Morby, Commissioner Burton, Commissioner Frower, and Morby are all ayes. Commissioner Wampler and Commissioner Barber were nays. And that passes. Okay. Sorry. Okay, thank you very much. We have a second item on the agenda. And Tammy will walk us through this as well. This is item 2.2 UVS012325. Oh, I'm sorry, I should break these apart. I made a note to make sure I did this. I'm so sorry. Before you start, on that item that we just voted on, did anybody want to explain their vote? And I will say that I would like to, so I'm gonna go ahead.
So,
Go ahead.
Yeah, I cannot vote for that in good conscience, having seen developments like this and knowing the Weaver Fire is 0 for 1. Dealing with a catastrophic event up there, and if something like that were to happen here, in this development with this density, giving the uncertainty, and given the structure of that road, the uncertainty with respect to parking, snow storage and such, it would be much more catastrophic in this situation, so I can't in good conscience vote for something like this at this juncture. And I certainly see that road change as not being de minimis, given that all the final details that have been left out. And it's just that bad things happen under difficult circumstances, and this is a very difficult circumstance up there, and I can't in good conscience vote for it.
So that was Commissioner Barber. Commissioner Wampler, I'm also just gonna explain my vote. The reason that I voted nay was just because I did find that change in exit to be a large enough change that I thought it should come back as a CUP amendment, which we were instructed that if we found that it was not de minimis, it should come back as a CUP amendment. So that's where I went nay, was I thought that the process should be that it, in my mind, it was a bigger change and therefore it needed to follow the process of coming back as a CUP amendment. And then we could make the other changes. So that's my reason for my nay. All right, if anyone else on the pro side, right? So moving on to the next agenda item.
Thank you, commissioners. This project, this is a request for preliminary approval of Sundown Townhomes. You just heard Sundown Condos, Phase 2. This is Sundown Townhomes, a separate project, though you will see the connectivity with these in just a few minutes here. The applicant is proposing a 22-unit townhome development in the DRR1 zone, located on approximately 3.349 acres. Couple of things to note, the DRR1 zone, each zone has development standards outlined in it, minimum lot area and width, setbacks, things like that. The DRR1 zone doesn't have any minimum lot area or widths. Applicant is also proposing private roadways throughout this development. This is the, just to kind of show you the change from having their secondary egress be here to going all the way through Sundown Condos Phase 2, but their primary is going to be off of Powder Mountain Road to the south. This is an existing road that currently accesses Sundown Condos Phase 1. I have to be careful when I say this, so I'm not mixing up projects here. The applicant is proposing 22 units with some detention areas for stormwater. They are also proposing, looks like 12 or 13, I think it's 12 parking stalls right here in the entrance. And then this 26-foot wide private roadway will continue through the development, connecting to the adjacent development, providing secondary access for that one as well. A couple of things to note with this is subject to the Powder Mountain Development Agreement. This is a page taken from the recorded development agreement. This is a little bit difficult to read, so I'm going to apologize, but this area here, which is the project area, is designated to have 80 units. The applicant is proposing 22 units, which was part of the contract from Powder Mountain when they purchased this property. That's the most that they can develop here. Powder Mountain can move these units elsewhere within their development. They have the acreage to do that. So I know that a question came up with Commissioner Barber regarding what sets the density. This development agreement sets the density for that area. That and the sales contract that limits them to the 22 townhome units. This is, again, just kind of a reiteration of where this will get its access up onto Summit Pass Road. Some standards to consider. The DRR1 zone typically requires about 60% of a net developable area to be set aside as open space. Powder Mountain has more than met that requirement throughout the development, and so this is not looked at as closely within this particular subdivision application. These are their minimum setbacks, and so we will require them to show that detail for these buildable building envelopes essentially as we get towards final approval. Again, with this one, we have required a formal approval from UDOT for access off of Powder Mountain Road. The applicant has been in the process with UDOT for approval of this development and the accesses and the increased impact of the access from the south. They've been in that process for the last year or so. But we haven't had anything, they haven't received anything in writing, granting a formal approval. This is a pretty standard subdivision. As far as the development agreement, really, there's not a whole lot in there there's nothing in what they're proposing that conflicts with the development agreement. Private roadways are proposed throughout. Weber Fire District is requiring hydrants as they have with the previous development. They want a hydrant plan. They're also requiring water suppression systems within the structures as well. And with this one, though this is not part of a conditional use permit, the DRR1 zone does require a pathway layout through this development. So we'll require them to show us where that will be located and how it will tie in to the pathway adjacent to the east prior to final approval. This would be your staff recommendation. Again, the representative for the developer is here if you have questions for him, or I'm happy to try and answer any questions as well that you may have for staff.
Tammy, you're number
I have a
5.
question.
Commissioner Morgan, if you could just wait 1 second, Commissioner Farrar beat you to it.
The additional
Okay.
parking, that's in addition to the 12, is that what you're referencing there?
If you feel you need that, these are 22 townhomes. This should have been one that was put on the other conditions as well, but these two highlighted in red were added. They're outside of what's in the staff report. These are added based upon discussion with the chair and vice chair last week.
Can you help me understand the difference between a townhome and a condo?
A townhome, Rick can probably explain this better. given his experience with condos.
Condo is just airspace, townhome is the physical land under it that's being sold. So if oftentimes you may have a unit stacked on top of another unit, that's can only be done with a condo. Whereas if it's from the ground all the way up, that's townhome. So it has to be the physical land that's touching to is the townhome. Thank you.
And we have planning requirements that are a little bit different from each other.
So in this case, will each of these units have their own garage? Since one may be stacked on top of the other, whereas
They would still be required to have the two side-by-side parking stalls. And are they proposing it with the garage?
They're proposing it with the garage, yes.
So then they would have a separate garage. And then I was gonna mention too, there's also different building standards. When you're dealing with the townhome versus the condo, there's different firewall requirements.
and this is townhomes, this is the space, this is not, we're not stacking
Correct.
residences on this, okay,
Right.
thanks.
Commissioner Marby, you had a question?
I have my question. Is this a request for a zone change?
This is a request for preliminary approval of a subdivision.
Okay.
Tammy, I wanted to see if you would help explain again question I brought up in our pre-meeting about the waiver. So the page 3 in our staff report, it talks about under the land use code of 106-2-2.020 B4. It's up to that, under the ownership, I'm not gonna sit here and read this whole thing, but it talks about a street parcel dedication waiver and that in your report, planning staff would recommend a waiver to the requirement of dedicating the land under the private street of the county for the purpose of future conversion to a public street. If you could just put that into simple terms for us.
Sure. Typically, when private roads are proposed and the planning commission and our county commission or land use authority considers these and approves them, one of the conditions of approval from the county is that the land underneath these private roads is dedicated. So at some point in the future, when we see a need for connectivity, when development continues on adjacent parcels that would require that connectivity as a public benefit, we would then have we would have a way to be able to get that road. So the county would own the land underneath the road essentially, but that road is maintained by an HOA. The county sees no really minimal public benefit to having this be a public road in the future, and so the planning commission can consider a waiver to that requirement that the land underneath the private roads be dedicated to the county.
So I wanna understand where we're marrying one, 1, 2, 2, 2 with 1, 2, 3, 2, 5, is that entire road from connecting to Powder Mountain Road at the top to connecting Powder Mountain Road to the bottom, is that gonna be a private road, not a public road?
That is a private road.
And developer has to take care of it, or the HOA takes care of it?
Correct.
But they can't stop the public from driving, they can't put gates up.
No, they cannot.
Including with
Including with the waiver.
with the waiver.
That's a good question. I don't know that I had considered that. Maybe Portland can, or Rick can explain that better.
Well, let me weigh in on this one, because I think that they possibly could.
Could put up gates?
I
Yeah,
think if we,
based upon the fire district.
At the bottom of page 2 of the staff report, it looks like it talks about that.
Hmm.
I'll pull up that code section. Is that a direct quote from the code?
Yes. 10622.020.
So, and it looks like it is, it's what it says there, it shall never be closed. The private street shall never be closed to the public. Let's see. The code section has, it looks like two different options, one for a private street open for general public use, and the other for a private street not open for general public use.
I guess I'm not sure if the waiver waives that public use benefit or not.
But I haven't been very well prepared for all these questions here, just look up on the fly, but so I'm not sure. Who makes the determination whether it will be open or not for general public use, but the waiver part, it looks like is under a private street not open for general public use. So it looks to me like this quoted section here at the bottom of page 2 would not apply at the same time as the street parcel dedication waiver would have to apply. If you want to give me a minute to read through the whole thing, see what
Or would it simplify to take it out of the recommendation?
and if you want, if whether or not it's closed or can be closed or gated, if that isn't something you're concerned about, then you can just, I mean, I don't even see it in the staff recommendation necessarily on page 4. That could be. That's just not even stated, and then. But I guess I don't know what the plan was for that.
Yeah, what was engineering recommending? Or did they?
They didn't make a recommendation outside of wanting these to be private roadways, which the applicant was proposing.
Did the fire district indicate anything one way or the other?
The fire district likes to weigh in prior to any kind of gating. I know they have heartburn with private gated communities because they're not always granted the access that they're required to have to these. And so I don't know if there have been discussions between the applicant and fire district. And I haven't read all the way through fire district's review, their latest review, to see if they have allowed that, but I don't think they've addressed it as far as gates. That hasn't even come up with planning either. So that might be a better question for the developer as far as whether or not that is planned. But it hasn't been mentioned at all.
Well, why is it that staff recommends the waiver? Why not just leave it where if the county or, if the county decided later on, I mean, it's up to the county, right? So
it's up to the county. I just know we just would rather not own the land underneath the roads. Where we're asking that they be private roads, we'd rather not own the land under the roads.
okay, the way that I thought I read it was a private street. Still allow the public. And you were still allowed the public and gave the county the option. Option for what, I'm not entirely sure, but. And what I was reading, that's why I wanted clarification, was that staff was recommending, because you didn't see. The potential down the road for the county to need to take ownership or do anything, and so therefore just waive that right, and I'm saying. well, if we don't waive the right and the county doesn't. Take advantage of their ability to take over, doesn't it just stay a private road? It just gives the county the option?
It does, but I don't know if it limits the developer as far as whether they can.
Well, I wouldn't think they could gate it at that,
Yeah.
because they don't, it's like a shared ownership.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the biggest problem we run into with these type of situations is that the HOA goes defunct and then they come back to the governing body and start begging the county or the city to take over these roads when they haven't been built to county standards. And it's like, why would we want to take that back on? Because it's gonna be a huge maintenance issue, and we oftentimes don't have snow plows. For smaller roads like this, we just have ones for bigger roads, and we don't want to take on those types of, roads.
So by recommending the waiver, you're kind of,
Washing our hands
done.
from it.
Okay, I see what you're saying, but it could potentially mean gates, and that could be a problem for fire and.
I do want to take note that while it was mentioned in the staff report, it was not included as a condition of approval. So that is, yeah.
I'd like to make a motion.
Well, one quick second, is there any other questions for staff or the applicant? Would the applicant like to talk about the townhouse?
There's questions.
Darren had a question for the applicant.
Is there a plan to put gates up?
No. No, there's not. Well, the only time gates have come up was with phase one because there's separate owners of the existing facilities. And gates were thought about to try and maintain the connectivity from phase one to phase two. We removed the roundabout. And that was the only time gates were ever discussed. It was looked down upon by the fire department and moved away from it.
Would you state your name for the record?
Yes, Guy Williams, yeah, civil engineer on the truck. The idea is just like provide guest parking because, you know, there's lots of traffic up there. And I personally don't know of any other discussions besides what I've been involved in that talk about gates, but the idea I get is they want it to remain open so other people can park and use the facilities as well.
Since you just mentioned it, it reminded me, so there is guest parking in this
Correct.
development?
Yeah.
Do you happen to know the number of spaces?
Currently they're at 12, we're trying to expand that though.
And it's right as you come into the community. And so then if people were to use that. So they're guests, I mean, what's your vision for this? Because if I lived in the second row, it's quite a walk.
Yeah,
Is there pathway? Is there off-road walking? Is there?
that's one of the things we're still trying to figure out. We have preliminarily designed some stairs between some of the units, provide access to the rows and roads above. And then with phase two, that parking, that red box where that we eliminated the curb, that is closer to those upper units. And so we are actually going to have easements written and dedicated, not dedicated, but written and being reviewed by all the owners to make sure that cross connectivity is not limited to any one person, is open to everyone, including those parking facilities.
I'll ask the question we talked about before. Where are you gonna put the snow?
Yeah, great question. Yeah. We're working on that
The
one.
retention ponds, is that what's down at the very bottom of the
Currently,
currently?
there are retention ponds being shown there. In final designs, we were thinking about going underground storage to make more surface availability. For snow, for parking, for pedestrian path, things like that, so we don't have such a. Because retention ponds on a hill like that are hard to have surface ponds because of only retaining a good flat surface. So the idea is to provide as much guest parking in the snow storage capacity as possible.
So I'm sorry, when you said underground storage, you meant from the.
Underground retention storage for
Okay.
stormwater, correct?
Any other questions for the applicant? Thank you. All right, and really quickly, in case, is there anyone online or in the audience that would like to speak about this particular item? Hearing no one, we'll close that option. Any further discussion from the commission?
I got a question. So, Tammy, in this report, staff recommends a waiver to the requirement dedicating the road, the land into the private street. That's on page 3, kind of last.
Yep, down near the bottom.
Yeah.
We would recommend it, but I didn't put it in the conditions of approval, but the planning commission can certainly include that.
Okay, and if you go up from your statement there, the number 2, so this would be 1062, 2.0, that stuff. Number 2, pathway in lieu waiver. Or if the land use authority may grant a waiver and in lieu require the dedication and installation of a 12-foot wide public easement pathway trail connection. So is that properly interpreted that if there is a waiver, it can only be done if there is an in lieu pathway or trail connection dedicated, or the land use authority may grant a waiver and may in lieu require a dedication, 2 separate items.
I would initially read that as 2 separate items because the overall waiver authority under A up above there says the land use authority may waive this requirement if development or further development on adjacent lots or parcels that this could be extended to is extremely unlikely, or to which future public access offers very little public benefit or future development benefit as determined by the land use authority. And then you go down, number 1 talks about certain types of streets that are not eligible for the waiver unless certain conditions are met. Number 2 talks about a specific case where future or current public access by vehicle is unwarranted. The land use authority may grant a waiver and in lieu require the pathway easement. That seems like an option in a specific case, separate from the overall option.
So in other words, could grant the waiver would not be required to, in lieu thereof, create a pathway easement.
Yes, that's how I read it.
Okay.
Any further questions or comments?
Okay, Tammy. In your staff recommendation, you propose a trail pathway layout be required prior to appearing before the land use authority. So was that recommendation for that condition made, understanding that it's not required?
It is required for the zoning and the development agreement. So they have to. have a
Okay,
pathway.
separate from the code.
Correct.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Any further questions or comments? I'll entertain a motion.
I motion or I move that this item be tabled until the applicant can give significant answers from the fire district and also be more specific on where the snow removal is going to be.
Okay, do we have a second?
Well, I'll second that with an addition that the parking be fully detailed. The guest parking or additional parking be fully detailed.
Commissioner Morby, do you accept the amendment?
I agree with that.
All right, so we have a motion to table this item for the applicant to come back with precise showing where the snow storage and easement area will be, as well as additional parking and something about.
Just make sure that it's mentioned private road. That's the whole caveat behind it.
Sorry, there was another part of your motion that had to do with emergency
Well, you said fire district.
fire district approval before they come back to us with this.
I think that's what he said.
Is that correct, Commissioner Morgan?
That's correct.
Okay. All right, so the motion is to table with those conditions to be met. I will call for a vote. All in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Okay, all opposed, say nay.
Nay.
Nay. Nay. All right, so it's 3-2, the motion fails. I will entertain a motion.
So I want to ask a question before I make a motion.
Yes.
I think the issue with the fire department would come after the approval of this. Is that not accurate, Mr. Grover?
Yeah, typically that's addressed at final approval, but you could require that preliminary.
So I'll explain my vote in that, my understanding was that that is written in here for it to be for final approval. Otherwise, the other two additional conditions, I would be fine with the staff recommendation. That was my reason for it, my neighbor.
And I would concur with your comment.
So I'll entertain a motion.
Quick question. Land use authority for granting the waiver, that is not the planning commission. That's the land use authority to whom the final plat comes. I'm looking at that, on page 3, a street parcel dedication waiver, the land use authority may waive this requirement.
I'm just looking in the code to make sure. I think it could be done by either or, because the land use authority could waive it at preliminary or at final. Because I don't see it specific, so I think it could be either or.
I was wondering if it's necessary to include that in the motion for us.
If you feel comfortable doing it, I would include it in your motion.
I agree, it doesn't appear to say, I see where you're saying the final plat shall dedicate that. That land, but the waiver is within the authority of the land use authority, which could be either one potentially, but I would encourage you to include that if you feel that it is appropriate. That way it's on the record and it doesn't rely on the final approval.
I'll entertain a motion.
I'll move to approve UVS 012325, subject to the requirements outlined in the staff recommendations, and that there be, that the applicant show on final where the snow is gonna go, that there be additional parking. And I'm a little confused about the waiver. I don't think the county wants to have to deal with the road, and so I would propose that it be a private road for the developer and the HOA to take care of.
Okay,
So the waiver would eliminate the requirement to dedicate the land for future public use. So
They cannot block either end of the road.
they potentially could block that.
So that, my motion will include that not be allowed.
Okay, do you want to include the waiver of the dedication requirement and also a requirement that they not block the road?
Yes,
Okay, that's what you're trying to say.
yes.
Okay.
Okay, so I have a motion to approve from Commissioner Frower with, based off of the staff recommendation and the findings and the conditions in the report, with the additions of conditions 4 and 5 as Tammy had stated in the, not in the current printed report, but online, which were 4 was snow storage easement and area to be shown on the final plat, 5 was additional parking to be shown on final plat. And then Commissioner Frower, you'd like to add
The way, say that again, Cortland, will you repeat what you just said so we get it right?
The waiver under, I will read the code section and references the county code section 106 -2 -2.020 subsection B 4. A, looks like B4A is the waiver section.
that be included.
Included in the motion.
So that would be number 6, that the waiver in land use code 106-2, we're gonna go on from there. And then number 7 would be in the road is not blocked.
That they cannot put gates
That can,
on either end of this road.
that gates are
Prohibited.
prohibited. Okay. I have it. All right, so we have 7 conditions here. Is there a second to that motion? So Commissioner Burton seconds. Any discussion? I'll call for a vote. All in favor of the motion to approve with the 7 conditions attached, say aye.
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 All who wish to reject the motion, say nay.
Nay.
Thank you. So the motion passes 4-1. The 4 in approval were Commissioner Morby, Burton, Thrower, and Wampler, and Commissioner Barber said nay. The motion passes. Thank you very much. All right, next on the agenda, we have public comment for items not on the agenda. Is there anyone online or in the audience that would like to speak? All right, remarks from planning commissioners. Does anyone, the commissioners have anything?
Thank you.
Okay. Director Grover, planning director report.
Don't have any comments.
Okay, Cortland, legal counsel.
Nothing.
Well then,
Adjourn.
second, approved. Thank you very much.
No problem.